The climb began the way most climbs did, quietly, without emphasis. There was no moment that felt like a beginning. The group moved out before sunrise, headlamps tracing narrow lines across the snow, boots finding a rhythm that required little thought. The air was cold but stable, sharp enough to wake the body without resisting it. Daniel Reeves walked in the middle of the group, not at the front, not at the back. It was a position he preferred. It allowed him to match the pace without setting it, to observe without being observed too closely. He had learned over the years that climbing was less about speed than about consistency, and consistency came from not standing out. The route was familiar in structure, if not in detail. A long, gradual ascent, broken by shallow ridges and short traverses. Nothing technical, nothing that demanded immediate decisions. The kind of terrain that invited forward movement simply because there was no obvious reason to stop. They had discussed turnaround times the night before. The numbers were clear, conservative even. There was room to adjust, room to pause, room to reassess. Turning back had been framed as a practical option, not a failure. If anything felt off, they would descend. Simple. Daniel had nodded along with the rest. He trusted plans that allowed for flexibility. He trusted margins. As they gained elevation, the sky lightened slowly. The mountains around them emerged in layers, pale and distant. Wind moved across the slope in short bursts, strong enough to be noticed, but not yet demanding attention. The weather was holding. That alone carried weight. The group moved steadily, stopping briefly every so often to drink or adjust gear. These pauses felt routine, almost automatic. No one sat down. No one lingered. The stops were short enough to feel like part of the movement rather than interruptions. Daniel checked his breathing early, out of habit. It was heavier than at lower elevations, but predictable. He adjusted his pace slightly, matching his steps to his breath. The change felt minor, corrective, exactly what it was supposed to feel like. Behind him, someone coughed. A dry sound, brief and unremarkable. No one turned around. Coughing was common this high. It meant nothing on its own. The Sherpa walking nearby moved with the same compact efficiency he had shown since the start. He carried less than some of the climbers, but his posture suggested weight regardless. He watched the trail more than the horizon, paying attention to the snow underfoot and the way it shifted with pressure. Daniel noticed this without assigning it meaning. They reached a shallow ridge and paused. The view opened briefly, revealing the path behind them. It looked manageable, clear. The descent, if needed, appeared straightforward enough. Someone commented on the conditions, noting how stable everything felt. The remark was met with quiet agreement. Turning back came up casually, almost jokingly. Not as a suggestion, but as reassurance. The option was there. Everyone knew it. Daniel drank from his bottle and replaced it carefully, making sure the cap was secure. Small mistakes became bigger ones in cold conditions. He had learned to be deliberate with simple actions. It saved energy later. The climb continued. As the slope steepened slightly, the group adjusted without discussion. Steps shortened. Poles were placed more carefully. The rhythm slowed, but it remained intact. Nothing about the movement felt forced. It was the kind of adaptation climbers expected and trusted. Daniel felt the first hint of fatigue settle into his legs. Not weakness, just weight. He noted it and moved on. Fatigue was information, not a problem. It told you how to pace yourself. It did not require action yet. They stopped again, longer this time. Gloves came off and went back on. A layer was adjusted. The cold pressed closer during the pause, then retreated once they moved again. Daniel stayed standing, shifting his weight occasionally to keep warm. Someone asked how everyone was feeling. The answers were quick and unembellished. Fine, good, normal. Daniel added his own without thinking about it. It was accurate enough. When they resumed, The trail narrowed slightly, cutting across the slope. Snow along the edges broke away easily underfoot, sliding a short distance before settling. It was not dangerous, just less forgiving. Daniel placed his steps with more care and kept going. The mountain remained unchanged, wide, quiet, indifferent. And for now, turning back still felt like an option. The change was gradual enough that it resisted definition. There was no clear line where the climb became harder. No moment anyone could point to later and say, "This is where it shifted." It happened in increments, measured more in sensation than in distance. The air thinned quietly. Breathing required a little more attention, then a little more still. Conversations shortened on their own, not because anyone decided to stop talking, but because words demanded energy that now felt better spent elsewhere. Daniel noticed it first in the timing of his steps. The rhythm he had settled into earlier began to loosen. Not break, just stretch. He found himself pausing for half a second longer between movements, adjusting his grip on the poles more often than necessary. None of it felt alarming. It felt logical. They had planned for this. At one of the scheduled stops, the group lingered longer than before. No one mentioned the time, but everyone seemed aware of it. Jackets were opened briefly, then closed again. Bottles were raised and lowered with more care, hands stiffening faster in the cold air. Daniel drank slowly, aware that swallowing now felt heavier than it should have. He waited for the sensation to pass. It did. Mostly. The Sherpa checked the route ahead, scanning the slope with a brief, practiced glance. His expression did not change. He said something to the guide in a low voice. Daniel didn't hear the words, and didn't feel the need to. There was nothing to interpret yet. When they moved again, the slope held its angle longer. The snow felt more compacted, the surface less forgiving. Each step required confirmation before weight could follow. Daniel shortened his stride without thinking about it. The adjustment cost nothing at first. A dull pressure began to build behind his eyes. Not pain, just presence. He blinked against the brightness of the snow and focused on the boots ahead of him. Looking too far forward made the sensation worse. He reminded himself to eat, pulled a bar from his pocket, tore the wrapper with his teeth, chewed slowly. The taste was distant. He swallowed anyway. Fuel was fuel, whether it was enjoyable or not. Someone behind him stopped briefly, hands on knees, then resumed. The pause went uncommented. Pauses were expected. Everyone had their own internal thresholds, and no one wanted to measure themselves against anyone else's. Daniel told himself he felt fine, not as reassurance, but as assessment. The statement was mostly true. They reached another point where the trail bent and the descent behind them came back into view. The slope they had climbed looked steeper from this angle, though Daniel knew it was the same as before. The mind adjusted its interpretation as easily as the body adjusted its pace. Turning back was mentioned again, this time with less humor. Still calmly. Still theoretically. Someone noted the time, comparing it against the plan. They were within margins. The numbers held. Daniel listened and said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence, his continued movement, was answer enough. The next stretch demanded more focus. Poles sank deeper into the snow. Foot placements took longer to confirm. Daniel noticed that when he stopped, restarting felt harder than it should have. Momentum had become something to protect. He stayed standing during the pause, even as others shifted or sat briefly. Sitting felt like an invitation to linger, and lingering felt inefficient. He told himself this was discipline, not stubbornness. His breathing grew louder inside his hood. Each inhale came with a faint resistance, as if the air were thinner not just around him, but inside him. He adjusted his pace again, telling himself it was temporary. The group continued upward. The mountain did not respond. It did not change its shape or its conditions. It simply remained, offering no signal that anything was wrong, and no confirmation that anything was right. By the time they stopped again, the idea of turning back still existed. It had not vanished, but it no longer felt equal to moving forward. It felt heavier. And for the first time, Daniel noticed that the option everyone kept referring to was beginning to demand more than it promised. The question was asked without urgency. It wasn't announced or framed as a decision. It surfaced naturally, almost politely, as the group paused on a narrow section of the slope where the wind pressed closer and the snow hardened underfoot. How everyone was feeling, whether the pace was still workable, how the time compared to the plan. Daniel listened, aware that the answers would matter more now than they had earlier. Not because the situation had suddenly changed, but because the margin for error had quietly narrowed. He assessed himself carefully. His legs felt heavy in a way that no longer disappeared once he started moving. The pressure behind his eyes had settled into a constant presence. Breathing required intention now, not adjustment. None of it crossed the line into something he would normally call a problem. But it was close enough to make naming it difficult. If he said he felt off, the group would turn back. He knew that. The option was still there, technically intact. The descent was long, but manageable. Conditions had not deteriorated. The plan allowed for it. If he said he felt fine, they would continue. That, too, was within the plan. He had not fallen behind. He had not stopped moving. There was nothing visible that demanded intervention. The responsibility sat in the space between those two outcomes. Daniel understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that neither choice was clean. Turning back would shift the burden onto the descent, onto legs that were already tired, onto attention that was beginning to fragment. Continuing would push further into thinner air with less energy to absorb what came next. Both paths carried risk. Neither could be framed as obviously correct. Someone else spoke first, noting the time again. The numbers were tighter now, but still within acceptable limits. Another voice mentioned how stable the weather remained. The words were factual, almost comforting. Daniel nodded along, aware that his agreement carried weight precisely because he did not stand out. If he looked strong enough to keep going, the group would read that as confirmation. He searched for a sensation clear enough to justify a decision. Pain, dizziness, anything that would make the choice external rather than internal. Nothing arrived. The guide looked toward him briefly, not expectantly, just checking. Daniel met his gaze and gave a small nod. It was not a declaration. It was an absence of objection. The decision settled without ceremony. As they moved again, Daniel noticed the shift immediately, not in the terrain or the weather, but in the meaning of each step. Forward movement now carried the weight of commitment. The option to turn back receded, not because it had been denied, but because it would cost more with every meter gained. He focused on staying efficient, on conserving energy, on maintaining the appearance of control. These were habits built over years, and they activated automatically under strain. Behind him, someone stumbled briefly, catching themselves with a pole. The sound drew a glance, then nothing more. Stumbles happened. They did not require interpretation. Daniel felt his attention narrow. Peripheral details faded. The slope ahead became the only thing that mattered. He placed his feet carefully, aware that correcting a mistake would take more effort now than it would have earlier. The idea of turning back surfaced again, uninvited. He pushed it aside, not out of denial, but because engaging with it felt unproductive. The choice had been made, even if it had never been spoken aloud. He wondered briefly whether he had waited too long to say something. The thought did not carry guilt, just recognition. They stopped once more, shorter this time. No one sat. No one suggested anything different. The silence felt heavier than before, filled with calculations no one shared. Daniel stood still, breathing hard, and realized that if he spoke now, the words would mean something different than they would have 10 minutes earlier. They would carry consequence rather than option. He said nothing. The group moved on, and with them, the decision. Not sealed by intention, but by momentum. The descent began without announcement. There was no clear signal that marked it as a turning point. The group simply stopped moving upward and adjusted their orientation, boots angling differently, poles placed with more caution than before. Daniel noticed the change immediately. Not relief exactly, but a subtle shift in expectation. Going down was supposed to feel easier. That assumption had followed them upward, quietly reassuring, rarely questioned. It did not hold. The first steps demanded more attention than he expected. His legs, already weighted by the climb, resisted the change in motion. Muscles that had settled into a repetitive pattern now had to relearn balance. Each movement downhill carried a sharper consequence for mistakes. He focused on his footing, letting the rest of the world narrow to the few meters ahead. The air felt no thicker. Breathing did not improve. If anything, the effort of stabilizing himself made it worse. They moved slowly, slower than on the ascent. No one commented on it. Speed was no longer a metric worth discussing. At one point, Daniel paused longer than intended. Not because he needed to stop, but because restarting felt uncertain. He planted his poles firmly and waited until the sensation passed. When he resumed, his steps were shorter, more deliberate. Someone asked if he was okay. The question was neutral, almost procedural. Daniel nodded. It was easier than forming an answer that might require interpretation. The trail behind them looked different now, less forgiving. Snow that had seemed compact earlier broke more easily under downward pressure. Small slips became harder to correct. Daniel adjusted again, using his poles more aggressively, compensating for fatigue he no longer tried to quantify. The group maintained its spacing, close enough to remain aware of one another, far enough to avoid compounding mistakes. This, too, happened without instruction. Experience filled in where words would have cost energy. Daniel felt the edges of his awareness dull, not dangerously, but enough to notice. He kept his eyes on the boots ahead of him, trusting that following movement would require less judgment than leading it. When they stopped again, he stayed standing, even as the slope pulled at him. Sitting felt risky now. The idea of having to stand back up carried its own weight. The mountain offered no reaction. It did not punish them for turning around, nor did it reward them for continuing earlier than they should have. It remained what it had always been, unchanged, indifferent, unmoved by intention. As they descended further, conversation faded completely, not from tension, but from necessity. Words no longer added value. Movement did. Daniel became aware of a quiet realization forming beneath the effort. Not regret, exactly. Something closer to acceptance. The understanding that the decision they had made earlier could not be revisited in its original form. Turning back had been possible. Then it had been difficult. Then it had simply been the only remaining direction. By the time the slope eased and the terrain widened, the worst of the strain had passed. Not cleanly, not neatly, but enough to allow the body to begin catching up with itself. They did not celebrate. They did not debrief. The descent continued until it no longer required constant attention. Later, Daniel would struggle to identify a single moment that defined the climb. There was no peak experience to isolate, no dramatic failure to explain. Only a sequence of reasonable choices made within narrowing limits. The mountain remained where it was, unchanged, and the climb ended not with resolution, but with quiet understanding. The mountain remained where it was, unchanged, unmoved by plans or intention. What happened here was not a failure of courage. It was a moment where limits quietly asserted themselves. There was no single mistake, only a series of reasonable choices made as the margin disappeared. Turning back did not vanish. It simply became harder than going on. The mountain does not remember names, but we do. Thank you for watching The Final Climb.